Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Good. Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Um, I apologize that I'm not used to speaking just to a screen. I'm used to being in a room full of people, as most of us are. So I hope that I can keep it interesting and relevant to everyone. And just like Chris said, please feel free to ask questions, and I'll leave some time at the end for questions from folks, because what we're going to do here is about 50 minutes of what I would consider a very brief overview of emotionally focused therapy. And so I'm sure that there will be a lot more questions. I also want to say before I start that this is something I'm really passionate about. I trained in this modality about 8 years ago. And excuse me. You know, when I discovered emotionally focused therapy, I realized that I had actually been looking for this modality my entire career. I don't know why I hadn't found it sooner, but it was very relevant to the kind of work that I was doing already. But it created a framework for me to really enhance what I was doing and have some real grounding with what I was doing. So I highly recommend the training. I am not a trainer, and I don't want to put myself out there as an expert. But I did do the complete training in emotionally focused therapy, and I've done other trainings since then, and I've also been using it in my practice for the past 8 years. I'm calling Sue Johnson, who has created this, does not call it emotionally focused relationship therapy, but I decided to use that title because I'm using it with couples and families, and you can also use it in individual therapy, which is something I don't do a lot of, but all of the skills apply in individual therapy as well. It just looks a little bit different, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move along here. So I want to go to the next screen and ask everyone, this is usually how we start when we talk about attachment or talk about emotionally focused therapy and the way that we use it at the Willows. So I want to ask everyone, it says 15 seconds, that's kind of short, but take a moment and just think about, in your growing up years, what do you wish your parents had done more of or less of, or just done differently? I know for most of us, it doesn't take long to think of that, but just consider that for a moment. And hopefully everyone is able to bring up some kind of thought or memory about the things that you felt like you had had more of or less of from your parents. More attunement, more engagement, more emotional presence, whatever that might be for you. I like to start with this because I want everyone to drop into the experience of what we're actually talking about and to kind of get yourself settled into that. Feel free to respond. I'm seeing some folks respond to the question and what they're coming up with. It's been my experience so far in all of the work that I've done and the trainings that I've done that everyone in the audience is able to come up with something that they wish they'd had more of or less of. And Kelsey, if you want to move to the next screen, we'll talk a little bit about attachment in general. I like some of the answers I'm seeing from folks. Most of us know about attachment, and some of us probably know a lot about attachment, so I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about that, but I include it here because emotionally focused therapy is really, the foundation of it is an attachment. If you read some of Sue Johnson's work or listen to her or do training with her, you'll learn that she was doing couples work and was trying to understand what is the emotionality and where do these conflicts come from in relationships, and had spent a lot of time asking herself that question, I guess, and eventually landed on, it sort of had an epiphany moment where she realized what's actually happening is what we would call attachment strategies. So in relationships, we are constantly working to make sure that we're being seen or we're being heard or that we're safe or that the person is really there for us. And this, as you know, is an innate human drive. We all have the drive to connect and feel safe and feel seen and taken care of. So in the early years, we get varying degrees of that safety and security from our families, from our parents. And often, most of us, particularly the folks we work with in treatment, have some level of deficit or unmet needs in their building of attachment when they're young. And you can see here in this slide that basically what secure attachment really is creating for humans is all of these things that are on here and more. But this is just a sample. It helps us create more emotional intelligence, higher self-esteem, higher levels of empathy, confidence, social skills, and intellectual capabilities. And just in general, it really creates this sense of self and knowing self and able to interact with the rest of the world in a way that is healthy and secure. I have some notes with me today because I want to make sure I don't miss some things. So I apologize. I'm going to look down at my notes occasionally. And what can happen in spite of even early secure attachment or a high level of secure attachment is what can happen is all kinds of attachment wounds, which is something else that we look at, particularly when we're doing family work. And I think the next screen has a list of some examples of attachment wounds that we see in clients that we work with, and probably in clients that all of you work with as well. This is, again, just a list, not a comprehensive list, but obviously a death, particularly a death of a parent, is a really extreme attachment wound. That's really falls more into the category of what I would call an attachment trauma. So suddenly that person's there and then they're gone. I also, in the work that I've done, and again, I'm really speaking from my work and my experience with EFT, and I do want to say that anyone who trains in this and uses this modality probably has their own experience. So I can only speak to what I have learned and what I notice in my work. One of the things that I have become more and more aware of over time is that divorce for many children is an attachment trauma. And the way that I try to help parents understand this when I'm working with families is to explain to them that divorce is something that two adults decide on and two adults do, and the children have no vote in that action. They, as I say, they don't have a dog in that fight. They really often really want their family to stay intact, even if things feel stressful or they're not perfect and wonderful. So it's not the child's decision to divorce. But unfortunately, what happens through divorce is that the kids often are the ones who are the most affected by that action, which I don't have any judgment about folks being divorced. I'm someone who's divorced myself, and I learned a lot about that through my own experience. But the thing to really recognize, and what we try to really help at the Willows, we try really hard to help parents understand the significant impact that has had on their kids, because we're trying to move the parents to a place where they can do some repair, because I think that's really important, and we'll talk about that some more. That's really what we're moving to all the time, is some kind of attachment repair or attachment strengthening. So just remember, I know I looked at the statistics this week because I knew I was going to be talking about this, and basically about 40% of all marriages end in divorce. And that's not even speaking to partners who are not married. That's just statistically the marriages that become divorced. So an enormous number of people in our country in particular have been through divorce and have a significant attachment trauma. Not every child has the same reaction, but very often there is a child in the family who's had some strong attachment response. Other things like moving around to different places, any kind of natural disaster that you've been through, chronic illnesses in a parent, or depression, any kind of chronic mental health issue in a parent can create a essentially what you're looking at is the child is looking to the parent to be there to provide nurturing and security and a sense of safety and presence. And if a parent is struggling with a mental illness, they are not able to fully be there for the child. Also, for any kind of physical illness, the parent, I've worked with a lot of folks who grew up with a parent who was in bed a lot or in the hospital a lot. And there's a sense of that person not being there for them. So all obviously neglect and trauma, and we also look at adverse childhood experiences, which most of you probably look at as well. And that's something that we assess all of our clients for when they come into our program. So basically what I'm saying is that you can create secure attachment in the first few years if you're very present and very emotionally engaged with your child and attuned. And some parents are. I think more and more these days we see more and more attuned parenting going on in this generation than we did in my generation when I grew up. Parents didn't even know it was important back then. So a lot of us were raised by really nice, kind, wonderful people who just weren't very attuned to their children. But essentially you can have secure attachment in those early years, but then as you go through your life, you might have some other attachment wounds or traumas that happen. So we're still looking at someone who is struggling partially as a result of attachment issues. And it's a lens to look through as you're working with folks. Obviously, there are a lot of other lenses, and many of you use a lot of other lenses and a lot of other modalities, but this is just one lens to look through. And in particular, we do that at Red Oak. We're looking through that lens all the time to understand what's the early story or what's the story with the family and where are some places where there's been some rupture or wounding or trauma. Another thing I want to say about attachment, yeah, that's good, Kelsey, you can move on. But another thing I want to say about attachment is that these days, a lot of folks are learning about attachment and utilizing attachment as a way of addressing their clients and a lens to look through. And I've noticed a lot of clients show up and talk about attachment styles. And we do talk about attachment styles somewhat in our program, and we do teach attachment styles to our families just so that they have a basic understanding of that. But what I've learned in my work with emotionally focused therapy, and I was told this in the early days when I was training, I was told, don't get too focused on attachment styles. But of course, in the early days, I didn't really understand attachment and how it showed up and all the nuanced ways it shows up. And so I was much more attached to trying to understand someone's attachment style. But what I've come to understand in doing this for 8 years, this work, is that it's not particularly helpful for me to try to know what an attachment style is of any particular client. So instead, what I look at and what I talk about in our work at the Willows is attachment strategies. And what we see every day, all day long, is various attachment strategies that our clients are using or that our families are using. And an example of some of those attachment strategies that you probably see in maybe yourself or in your clients is things like clients who are pleasers. So they're always going to smile and agree and go along with their parents or their peers as a way to ensure that people like them and people stay connected to them. We also see attachment strategies where some folks have really significant disorganized and more on the avoidant end of attachment style. And their strategies might look like when they feel somewhat insulted or offended, they push really hard and push people away completely, because that's where they find their safety, is when people are not too close. You also, in disorganized attachment, see clients who, when they want to get close, so this is where, some of the ambivalence and the anxious plus avoidant can show up, is when clients really want to be close to others. And we have a community program, it's a residential program. So women are there with a number of peers, and they're forming these really wonderful connected relationships. But a lot of them are coming in with attachment wounding. So they want to form these close relationships, but then when they get too close or too intimate or too vulnerable, then they start to act out in some way. Like, they get angry, they push people away, they're maybe kind of more mean to some of their peers, or they start to say that they want to leave treatment. That very often can happen when someone has been extremely vulnerable and open with their peers, and then they begin to feel unsafe because they've been vulnerable. And their historical experience in terms of attachment is that if you get too vulnerable, something might happen to hurt you, and then you're not safe and secure. So then clients will start to say, I need to leave treatment, and they'll make up a lot of rationalizations for why they need to leave treatment. But what's really going on sometimes is this deeper level of attachment stress or attachment anxiety. So attachment strategies are going on all the time with families, sometimes, particularly when their loved one is addicted and they've been dealing with that addiction for a number of years. An attachment strategy is to dismiss and reject that person because it's too painful to be in relationship with them and they're too uncertain. I just this week, I've been in communication with a mother who one day she said, I'm beginning to have a lot of hope for my daughter for the first time in many years as I watch her go through this program and talk with her and talk with you guys as providers. And then the very next day, she said, I'm realizing that I'm getting really anxious because I'm afraid to hope because, I've been, living in hope for so many years, and then it hasn't worked out. And then my daughter's not there. She's not present. And so partially what's happening is the mother grief of losing her child, but also what's coming up for this mom is some of her own early attachment wounding around, someone not being there and not being able to trust that someone's going to be there. So potentially that can just ebb and flow all the time for folks. And this particular mother, though, the good news is that she's someone who has a pretty extreme capacity for emotional stress or distress. And so she's hanging in, which is really good to see. So on this screen, we have just that this modality was created by Sue Johnson. Her books are Susan R. Johnson is how that's her actual formal name. She did develop it originally with another person, but it kind of broke off and went off on her own. And she is the primary person who kind of pushes forward this modality and has written books and does trainings and oversees training. And there is an international organization, which I can give you that information also if you don't have that. But there is an international organization, which is something that she is in charge of. So again, like I said earlier, it evolved through her trying to understand what's going on in couples when they're in conflict and in rupture, and had studied attachment. Really, she had, she did some significant study in attachment. Any of y'all know about Sue Johnson, and began to realize that that's a lot of what was going on for folks. And the goal is really attachment. We talk about attachment strengthening and repair at our program because we don't want to be too lofty and say that we're going to create secure attachment, because folks who have a really insecure attachment style or system, what we don't know yet is that a lot of us will live the rest of our lives with some of that insecure attachment system going on, but we will learn to cope with it and create accommodations for it. I know for myself, that's a perfect example of what happens for me, is that my sort of old patterns of insecure attachment show up anytime there's some kind of distress in relationships. But the difference is in how I respond to it now versus how I responded to it, say 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. It's really different, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't show up still. And that's another thing that we try to help clients understand, that we're not trying to make this go away. If your knee-jerk response to relationship disruption is to become super anxious and work really hard to get that person back connected to you, that impulse is probably going to continue to show up. But what's going to look different is the way that you handle and the way that you manage that impulse that shows up, because you're going to learn, you're going to understand more about it and have a real ability for self-evaluation, and also know how to calm your system. It's basically just a side note. What happens when an attachment disruption happens and we become activated is that our nervous system gets activated. And that's a whole other, branch of clinical work, and looking at things like polyvagal theory to understand the connection. That actually what's happening, the way I describe it sometimes to our new clinicians is, if you can imagine that small child in a crib and they're crying and no one's responding. And so they become more and more activated and their nervous system gets very activated. And then we go into sort of a distress or even panic mode, because we feel the fear is that I'm all alone and no one's there for me. And so that's kind of sounds like an extreme example, but it really gets the point across for folks to understand what's happening with our clients when they are beginning to act out because of attachment disruption. Okay, and so Sue Johnson developed this model for couples, and most of the research has been done with couples. And for a long time, it was only available, training for couples work was all that was available. And when I did the training, there was very little training in emotionally focused family therapy. And as I was going through the training, I knew that I was already working with families, and was really interested in figuring out how to translate it to family work. I happen to have a trainer who doesn't do family work and who is an excellent trainer that I would highly recommend. But he said to me over and over, Lynn, I don't work with families, so I can't really help you with that. I don't really know how you're going to translate that. But by about the time I finished my year of training, I started to see some trainings, very few, but a couple of trainings in emotionally focused family therapy, and I was able to attend one of those. So I guess just a basic thing to know about EFT versus EFFT is what we call the family work, is that it's essentially the same. You're using most of the same skills and the same lens. So you're doing the same work, and the same techniques and skills apply. The biggest difference in couples work and family work with EFT is that in families, there is no what we call mutuality. And the mutuality in couples work is that you're working with two people, two adults essentially, who are mutually working. The goal is to get them both to help calm and meet each other's attachment needs that they have with each other. And so you're working with them in what, sort of a side-by-side mutual. You want to treat them equally. With family therapy and EFT, you're not doing that, because it's not the child's responsibility or job to meet their parents' attachment needs. It doesn't work that way. Children cannot meet or repair or resolve parents' unmet attachment needs. But what shows up in EFFT is the parents' unmet attachment needs also. And that work is really important, but generally you're going to refer those parents out to do their own individual work so that they can delve into their own childhood separately from their children. And a lot of that gets identified and assessed in the family setting. But in terms of actually doing the deeper work with parents, that's something that you would always want to refer them out to someone, is especially when you see that there's some significant attachment wounding, particularly what really looks like trauma, what shows up as trauma. And by the way, on the note of trauma, most folks who show up have some level of trauma, but when it's extreme, I will say, my sort of humble experience is that I have not been terribly successful in helping couples where one or both have extreme trauma, particularly when they are not in their own individual work, doing their own individual work with another therapist. So, because what you're focusing on in emotionally focused therapy obviously is emotion. and you're really targeting and tracking and heightening emotion in the work. So when you have someone with pretty significant trauma, and you are focusing on emotion, you're going to be you're encountering someone who has potentially not a lot of capacity to experience that emotion. So they're going to become very activated in the session, and it can be, you can lose, you can lose control of the session pretty easily. In fact, the few sessions that I've had where I've had someone really lose control or storm out of the office have been with folks who have extreme trauma. So that kind of brings me to this next piece. I'll talk about this a little bit. You can go to the next screen if you want, Kelsey. So when you're beginning to do EFT work with someone, with a couple or a family, you start with an assessment. So here's how it goes kind of practically. When let's say a couple calls you and they want to come in for couples work, you are going to have them come in together. And what I do is I ask each of them to tell me the story of their relationship and how they fell in love, which I find to be a really kind of a sweet way for me to be able to see the level of love that is still present in the relationship, and also on the converse side to see the level of relationship fatigue that exists. So I want them to tell me their story, each of them separately but in the same room. And I'm going to start already doing what we call enactments, where I'm having them turn to each other and share some of that also. So for example, one of the partners might tell me a story about the moment they fell in love with the other partner. And at that point I might say, does your partner know that that's your story about the moment you fell in love? And they may or may not say yes or no, but I might ask them to turn to their partner and tell them that story. So not just look at me as the therapist and tell me the story, but actually look at their partner. Because what we're beginning to do is have them have the experience together, because EFT, Sue Johnson calls it an experiential modality. So you're really trying to create this emotional experience between the people in the relationship, whether it's couples or siblings or parent and child, it doesn't matter. And I've done a lot of work with siblings, and that's really fun work too, to see siblings turn to each other and talk about their relationship needs that they're not getting in that relationship. Yeah, so I love the comments. You guys keep sending comments. So what you're going to do is assess the relationship, get them to tell you the story of the relationship, really kind of an overview of the relationship, I guess. And then the next session or the next few sessions are going to be spent with one person or the other. So you're going to separate them out for individual sessions, and you're going to assess that individual. You're going to really you're looking for some specific markers or specific information that might be rule outs to do an emotionally focused work. So one of the rule outs would be if someone is involved in an infidelity during that time. So if someone admits to you that they are involved in a relationship outside of this particular relationship, you're going to try to, I've had this situation happen a couple of times. Once I was able to support the partner in telling their partner that they were involved in another relationship, and therefore they were going to do separate work before they started doing couples work. And then in another situation, I was not able to help that person tell his partner that he was involved in another relationship. And what he and I agreed to do in the individual session is to do a couple of sessions where I would support him and help him hopefully be able to tell his partner. He was not able to tell his partner after a couple of sessions. And so at that point, I found a way to end the session and the relationship and referred them on to someone else. So that, because what you don't want to do is heighten emotion with two people who are not really fully present and attuned with each other. You don't want to make the other person vulnerable when the partner is actually not even wholly in or fully in the relationship. Another rule out is any kind of abuse, any significant emotional or physical abuse that's going on, or sexual abuse. If you, and sometimes you don't know this, obviously, but if you're able to determine that there's any kind of abuse going on, that is a rule out for EFT, because again, you don't want to support the one person being vulnerable emotionally with someone who's abusing them. And abuse is something that often will show up after a few sessions. You won't know that initially. If you do, obviously, you want to rule out. And how you present that to the couple when only one person has told you what's going on is tricky. And but it's important to find a way to do that, because you don't want to keep them in the experience. So just look at my notes here. I want to see. Yeah. So, and here we go. So EFT is broken down into 3 stages. So this is a really great way to train and to learn the modality. But just like attachment styles, I will say that you don't want to get too focused on the stages and where you are and which stage you're on or which step. That is not what you want to be focusing on. And again, that takes a while too. When you've done the training, it took me a while to stop thinking about, how do I get this couple to stage 2? I can say that now when I'm doing the work, I'm really not thinking about that. It's much more generalized, and I'm just more specifically looking at where each person is and what kind of work is going on and what the next step is. But essentially stage 1 is cycle de-escalation. So the term that Sue uses in EFT is cycle. So she says that everyone is in a relationship cycle. And she demonstrates that through an infinity loop, which I have a slide of that in a few slides. I'll show you that. She uses the infinity loop to show the cycle that folks are in. Again, this can be true for romantic partners. It can be true for families, entire families, or each of the relationships in families. It can be true for siblings. It can also be true for friends and friendships. And this particular modality can work well for friendships or even peer relationships in a program like ours, which is residential. I've actually done a little bit of this work with a close friend of mine, where we've actually done several trainings. We did this training together. We've done some other trainings together, and we've been able to talk about the places where we become activated in sort of attachment distress with each other. And once we're able to name it and understand it, we are able to be more attentive to that in the relationship. And it's, it's sort of uncanny to me, some of the things I've learned, just little nuanced things that I do that have nothing to do with the other person. There's absolutely no intention or no thought about doing a certain move or an action because of the other person. It's just something that's probably an old habit of mine or an old pattern, but it can activate another person and activate some attachment distress for them. So it's a really cool thing to talk about in any of your relationships, because you don't know. You kind of don't know until you know. You can feel it when there's a rupture, but you don't always know what happened. So, but it's a great way to train and to learn the modality. So one of the things I will say about EFT, when I trained in EFT, they talked about it being a short-term therapy, brief therapy. And I have learned that I'm not sure what brief means, number one, and often it doesn't feel like what I thought was brief, but maybe that's brief therapy. I've done some of the work that I've done with couples when I've been really successful. And again, I'm not always successful. I think that's really important to remind people. But some of the couples I've worked with where I've been really successful have been a year and a half or 2 years. So if that's considered brief therapy, which I guess with some types of therapy that might be considered brief, then it can be brief. What I've also found is with couples who are newer in their relationship and there's not a lot of conflict fatigue or relationship fatigue, it can be even briefer. Once they really understand their cycle and begin to share more openly and vulnerably about the emotions that are going on for them, they can often, graduate from therapy and go on and manage it on their own. So it can go in every way possible. But essentially, stage one, you're going to spend most of your time in this therapy in stage one. So the largest amount of time will be spent in delineating the cycle. So really trying to understand the cycle. And the thing to remember and to think about is that when a couple or a family comes into your office, they have quite a history with each other. And they've been through many disruptions and repairs and conflicts. And there's just a lot of, water under the bridge, if you will. And you don't know anything about their history. So really, we're coming in as therapists as this brand new observer. And I will tell you that it can take me quite a while to truly understand the cycle for some couples. There are couples occasionally who show up and in the first session, you go, bingo, I see the cycle right away. But there are other couples where it's much more diffuse and complex, and it's a lot harder for me. It may not be as hard for everyone, but it's harder for me. And I can spend months trying to truly understand the cycle. So for me, what's happening initially is that I am trying to understand the cycle. I'm not working to try to help them understand the cycle necessarily because I don't really understand it yet. And so again, in step two, it says identify the negative interaction pattern. And what you're asking folks to do when they come in is to tell you, you start like you would any therapy session where you say, how are you doing? How's the week been? And with couples, they are most likely going to tell you about the last argument or conflict or disruption that they had, or rupture. Rupture is another word we use a lot. So they're going to say, well, last Saturday, here's the thing that happened. And as they begin to tell me what happened, I want to get them to start at the very beginning. So sometimes couples will start at the end of the argument. And what I'm going to do is rewind them to the beginning. And the beginning might even be the night before. So I might start to get a sense that actually there was some energy going on the night before, which then led to Saturday afternoon. So I'm going to try to get as close to the beginning of the cycle as I can, and so that I can understand how some of these patterns start, these negative interaction patterns start. And sometimes it can be so simple and so nuanced, it's really easy to miss if you're not focused on this. And one of the things I found kind of a little bit humorous a few years ago was seeing quite a few couples, and it was the fall, and the temperature had just changed. We're in the mountains, I'm in Asheville, and so we had just gone from summer to fall, and pretty brisk, cool air. It was down the 60s or something like that. And almost every couple that came into my office for about 2 weeks talked about their cycle. Their pattern started with one or the other asking the other to close the windows or open the windows. So it was, they thought that had nothing, that they had to work hard to get back to where it started. And it actually started with the windows, which I found pretty humorous because it was the time of year. And so it can be something so simple and so nuanced and, so pedestrian in a sense as doing the dishes or opening a window. And it can start the cycle. Identify the cycle, then you want to dive deeper into the feelings. So what happened to you when you asked your husband to close the window, but he didn't respond to you right away? And you were feeling really cold. You're sitting there feeling very cold, and he's kind of gets distracted and does something else after he said he would close the windows. So then you start to get into the emotion and really unpack that emotional experience. And what your sort of your job is as an emotionally focused therapy is to reflect the emotion. You want to be careful to not reflect a lot of thought. So the other partner might say, I felt really ignored. And so what I'm going to reflect is not so much, oh, so you felt ignored. I might say, it sounds like that was really painful for you to feel ignored. So what I'm doing again is I'm reflecting the emotion. What I say is when you spend too much time reflecting thought, this is another sort of early therapist move, that we will ask a lot of questions well, what was that like? Or how did that feel? So Sue Johnson, her famous line is like, how is that for you? Because what she's really trying to get someone to do is talk about the sort of the visceral emotional experience. So when you start to ask, well, what do you think about that? Or what do you know about that? What's happening is that we're actually provoking the client to go into the prefrontal cortex and to talk about what they think. So we're moving them out of the emotion. And emotionally focused therapy, it's okay to do that sometimes. You don't want to keep people in deep emotion all the time. But essentially what you're working toward is to get them in the emotion. So when someone says, my husband didn't close the window, I might miss that if I weren't an EFT therapist. I might say, oh, yeah, okay, well, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but anyway, it turned into a big deal. Let's figure out but what happened is the person became activated, and that activation is connected to attachment needs. I need to know, are you there for me? Do you care about me? Do I matter? And of course, in their cognition, they know that they matter to that person, but the internal experience, the nervous system, doesn't know, so to speak, that I matter because I asked you to do something, you said you were going to do it, and then you didn't do it. And not only am I feeling sort of ignored, but I'm also sitting here feeling cold. So I actually have a need, which is to feel warmer. And so, so you move through stage one. Again, stage one may take a long time. As you begin to understand the cycle, then you can begin to present it back and help them understand it. So help the couple or the family understand what's happening. So we can go to the next slide if you want, Kelsey. And so when somebody is mentioning, clients sometimes minimize their feelings. Absolutely, people will do that a lot, especially in the early stages because they don't feel safe enough to be vulnerable. And that, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because one of the things I haven't said is that as a therapist, one of the things that you're doing is trying to actually create somewhat of a secure attachment with your clients. So a couple of things I didn't mention that I'll mention now. When you're working with two folks in emotionally focused therapy, you want to work very hard to create an alliance, almost an equal alliance with each person in the room. It's never about who's the bad guy. It's never about whose fault was that. And I think a lot of folks do couples work because I hear couples come to me and they say, yeah, we saw this other person and it seemed like they were always siding with this person or that person, or, kind of told me that I needed to, that something was wrong with me, basically. And in EFT, the way that I present it to couples is I say, the cycle is actually the focus of therapy, not one partner or the other. And I even go as far as to say, actually, I consider my client to be the dynamic that exists between the two of you. And I don't want to over-align with either one, which is another piece I would say is that in particular, I would never do EFT couples work with someone that I'm already doing individual work with. So I might, if I'm doing individual work with someone, I might have their partner come in and do a couple of sessions, but I'm not going to really go into EFT work in that case. In that case, I would send them to someone else. Or, when other folks I know are working with individuals, they send them to me for couples work because you want to be really careful about that alliance. And that alliance can get broken very quickly and very easily. And I am here to witness that. I've had that happen for me in several couples work where I have made a misstep. And, if it was an individual session, I'm sure I could have repaired the misstep. But in couples work, it's so heightened and so fraught in what's going on in the room. And if one person has significant attachment distress and feels like the therapist is not there for them, but is there for the partner, you can really quickly lose that person. So that has happened to me. So one of the things that you're tracking, and you are constantly tracking in EFT, you want to track what's going on in the room. Sometimes you're using just a look that goes on in the room, and you're gonna dive into that and say, what's happening right now? I noticed you looked at your partner like this when he said this or she said this. Can you talk about what just happened? That's in EFT, you do that a lot. You really use what's going on in the room a lot. But some of the statements, and these are particularly with kids, with families, with parents, a lot of the attachment statements we hear, and as you begin to look through this lens, you hear a lot of attachment statements are what we call reaches in this work. And so you'll hear kids a lot of times say to their parents, "You never care what I think." And the parent goes, "Oh, I really care what you think." But really what's going on is the kid is saying, "I feel like I don't matter to you. I don't feel like you really see me." And so there's some need for repair around that. Um, it's not what I say to parents all the time, this is not a fact-finding mission. It's not up to you to say, "That's not true. I always care what you think." What you really want to do is say, "I'm so sorry that that's your experience. And help me know how I can change that, because I do care what you think. But obviously I'm saying something or showing up in a way that doesn't communicate that to you." So these are some other examples. "You never listen to me. I'm worried about telling you the truth," which means I think I can't tell you the truth safely. I think you're going to have a reaction which then is going to activate me and shut me down. "You always seem preoccupied. You don't understand me." These are, some typical statements you hear in couples, but certainly in families, we hear a lot of this. And in my job, I consider it my job as an EFT therapist to translate those statements to parents so they actually understand that their child is making a reach for connection with them. The kid is not really saying, "You never listen to me." The kid is really saying, "I feel like I don't matter, and I feel like what I have to say doesn't matter. The way that you respond to me makes me feel unheard and like I don't matter." So when I initially did this training and I was really sort of a novice at looking through this lens, I remember struggling with catching attachment statements. And what I notice now after doing this for 8 years or so is that when I'm supervising clinicians in our program, they will tell me a story about something that's going on with the client. And I'm able to point out that's an attachment reach, that's an attachment strategy. So after you do this for a while and you get really versed and kind of sink into the work and read as much as you can about attachment, which I recommend, it becomes pretty obvious when people are reaching for connection. But it isn't obvious in the beginning, so it's okay if it doesn't feel obvious to you. So we can go to the next slide, and I know I want to watch the time. So stage 2 is bonding. This is where you've identified the cycle, and now you're moving into actually heightening some of the emotions and reflecting the emotions that are going on with each partner, and having enactments where you have them turn to each other. So the person may go into an explanation of how they felt on Saturday when it felt like the partner wasn't listening to them. And as the therapist, I'm going to reflect that emotion. Sometimes you're reflecting emotion that hasn't been stated, but you're guessing at what it feels like. And that's okay, because clients will correct you. Obviously, we know that. But often, and after you do this a while, you can usually nail it. And if nothing else, you can always say, "It sounds like that's really painful." Or "Sounds like that was hurtful." So that encompasses a lot of emotions. And so you're going to move them into this bonding where they're actually sharing this with each other. When you do this, "It feels really scary to me, and I feel like you're not there for me." And the partner is many times going to say, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea. I'm just doing this to take care of me. I had no idea how it affected you." I had a couple once I worked with who every time they had a rupture, the male partner in a heterosexual couple would get in his car and drive to the local grocery store and sit in his car in the parking lot. And she eventually knew where he was and what he was doing. And then she was, what we would call a pursuer in this vernacular. She would start texting him, and he would not respond. And the more activated she got, and the more she pursued, of course, the more he wanted to withdraw. So everyone's just trying to protect and take care of themselves and keep themselves safe. So they are not stopping necessarily to go, "Oh man, maybe my partner is feeling really hurt when I do that." So when the partner turns to them and begins to share that, and usually in a very vulnerable, emotional way, the partner is able to hear it. As long as you've de-escalated them. When you're still in the escalated cycle in the early days, sometimes you'll get other kinds of responses from the partner. But as you begin to de-escalate the couple, they begin to be able to really just kind of de-escalate and calm down and hear their partner. And it begins to promote a lot more acceptance of those pieces of each other, and even love and care for those pieces of each other. And you just continue to do that. Another thing to think about is that in my work, and I'm assuming this is pretty typical, but it's certainly typical for me, I feel like I sometimes move back and forth between stage 1 and stage 2. So we'll sort of move into stage 2 in some area or with one of the partners, but then they'll come back the next week and I realize that they're really reactivated and we're back to sort of de-escalating the cycle. So it's kind of like, that kind of up and down, up and down, up and down until the couple begins to be able to do this work for themselves, and they don't actually necessarily need the third person in the room to reflect and facilitate. And a beautiful example of that, and I think maybe I'll close with that. I think there's one more slide we'll show. Oh, there's a couple more slides. But what I'll say is, we can go to the next slide, Kelsey, which is stage 3. Stage 3 is really when you're consolidating these changes that are happening. And you can really begin to see what can happen in stage 3 is that you're no longer saying to the couple, the partners, why don't you turn to each other and tell them this, how you feel. They're starting to do that on their own. You will see that happen. And a beautiful example of this is a couple I worked with for a couple of years came in. It was clear that they were moving toward the end, and then they came in for what ended up being their last session with me. And what they said, they both agreed, only one was talking, but they said, what we realize is that for 2 years, we have been really leaning on you to help us know how we feel and to help us have these conversations with each other. And what's happening now is we recognize we're leaning on each other in these moments. And that really informs us that it's a good time to take a break from therapy. So it was a beautiful way of stating what happens for couples. And, they could show up again. Obviously, it can go up and down, but that's been almost a year and I haven't seen them. So I think they're doing well. And we can go to the next slide. I just want to cover this one. This is the relationship cycle, the infinity loop that Sue Johnson uses. And what you can see here is that they're equal. So the two people in the relationship are having equal experiences. Because if there's not an equal attachment experience going on for each person, usually what you have more likely is one person who doesn't have as much attachment distress and is able to attune and be present for the other person's attachment distress. They don't get into their own attachment distress. So a lot of times couples will come and they say, well, I don't think I have any of these issues, but I think she does or he does. And I kind of chuckle to myself because what I really think is that couples are probably, for the most part, not going to show up in your office if one of them really doesn't have attachment distress, because they're going to be able to manage that by themselves without coming to a therapist. Another thing you can see happen all the time with couples is that initially, often it's one, but sometimes it goes back and forth, that they really want you to agree with them on who the bad guy is. And in EFT, you really, in any kind of couples work, obviously you don't want to ever do that. But in EFT, you want to be hyper vigilant about that, about not buying into this idea that one of the persons did something that's so egregious or so wrong, or and people will use words like that. But isn't it just wrong to do that? Isn't that wrong? And you want to keep coming back and saying, what I hear is that it's really hard for you when she does that, or what I hear is it's very painful when he does that. There's no universal right and wrong. What's happening is this cycle that happens between the two of you. So you want to keep bringing it back to the cycle, keep bringing it back to the cycle. And and then is there a last slide or just the last slide? Yeah, I had an activity. We don't have time for another activity, but we will take if anyone has questions that they've sent. Yeah, and the resources, there's also another resource that is Emotionally Focused Family Therapy book that's come out since the slide was made. I recommend all of these books. I will say Sue Johnson's first book, The Practice of Emotionally Focused Couple Therapy, in my opinion, is not as well written as her Attachment Theory and Practice. So I would recommend you start with the attachment theory. And Daniel Wallen talks about attachment in psychotherapy, and it really speaks to building secure attachment in your therapeutic relationship. So there's all great resources. And Sue Johnson, I think there's some resources on YouTube even, and their international organization also. There are videos. You can buy videos and find trainings there also. So, yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. What great information. We have lots and lots of questions. So,
Do we?
yeah, we do. So we'll go through some of these as we end the presentation, but just as a reminder, we did record today's presentation. That will be available. A link will be sent to you in an email later this afternoon, as well as instructions on how to complete the evaluation if you would like to receive contact hours for viewing today's presentation. So Kelsey, if you want to help me with the questions, we can feed them to Lynn. We can kind of work from each other. So Lynn, one of our attendees asked, how does EFT support a couple where one partner is challenged with understanding the feeling state of their partner and offering empathy? It's a good one.
That's such a great question. And I've worked with those couples. I've worked with a couple of couples where one partner is, you know, kind of more what we might say on the autism spectrum. So they don't really, emotions are not a go-to for them. And sometimes they can't even grasp emotions. And I remember the first time, and it's a couple that I feel like has been very successful with EFT. I had to really kind of explain the emotional experience of the partner in a little bit more of a roundabout way for that person. But when it sort of happened spontaneous for me because I'm not normally that great at, you know, concrete, but I kind of understood this person well enough at that point and had enough of a connection that I was able to sort of use some metaphors that were more concrete metaphors and work my way to the person grasping the emotional experience without using specific emotional language. So I will say that that's tricky, but it has definitely worked for me in a couple of couples. I work with a couple right now where one of the partners is also much more concrete and a little more what you might see autism spectrum, but also has a lot more emotional intelligence, I would say, than the other person I worked with. And I do some of the same stuff with this person, you know, so I know I'm not being specific about what I do, but I do think there's a workaround to help them understand that. Yeah, it's a great question.
Excellent, excellent. Do you have any statistics on the success of this therapy?
I don't have that written out here, but you can find that. And emotionally focused therapy for couples is it's one of a couple modalities that has the most success. And Sue Johnson and other trainers and researchers have done a lot of studies with emotionally focused therapy with couples. The military's actually used it a lot too. So there have been some studies, I think, in the military. There have been stuff. One of the questions I saw on my screen was about substance abuse and addiction. And there are several people who do trainings in EFT with addiction around the country. So you can find those trainings for sure. So that you can definitely do that work with someone who has addiction or is in substance abuse, in active substance abuse, or in recovery for sure. But the research is great. The outcomes are great for EFT couples therapy. There's not as much study in emotionally focused family therapy, but I suspect that'll change in the next 5 years or so.
Excellent, excellent, great information.
So I saw a couple of questions come through regarding infidelity and about previous infidelity. So if for instance you're working with a couple and it's, you know, was a previous thing that took place in the past, and how do you deal with that? Are you able to work with them with EFT?
Yes.
This is something that has happened?
Yes, actually that, you know, and folks who are, I'm not going to put myself out there as an expert in that area. I've worked with several couples who have had an earlier infidelity that everyone knows about, and it's all above board and everything about it. I worked with a couple who had a very recent infidelity, and I feel like there was some good work that happened there, but I think the partner who had the infidelity was no longer really, fully in the relationship. But absolutely, and Sue Johnson and folks like that who are good, they do a lot of works with people who have had infidelities. Yes, very successfully.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lynn, do you have any recommendations for training in the Memphis area? One of our viewers wanted to know.
So I don't know of trainers in Memphis, but there is a trainer and a center in Nashville. And you know, these days they're all doing it remote telehealth, because our family therapist is completing EFT training. She went to the original, what they call an externship in person, and then COVID hit. So she's doing what they call the advanced core skills remotely. So now I would imagine they're doing the externships remotely also by Zoom. So there's a center in Nashville. My trainer is in Atlanta. His name is Michael Barnett. I'm just going to say that. He's a super busy guy, but he's an excellent trainer. I highly, highly recommend him. I've been in some brief trainings with some other folks who are good, and I still try to get all of our folks to go to Michael for their training. And he usually co-presents with someone who's really good. There's just, you know, I don't know, in terms of really great experienced trainers in EFT, there's maybe, you know, 10 or 20 around the country. But there are, for instance, Atlanta has an EFT center. So if you look up EFT Atlanta or EFT Nashville, it's going to pull those folks up and their websites. And then the international organization is ICEEFT. ICEEFT. And Sue Johnson is Canadian, so it's, you know, they're international organizations based in Canada. And a lot of the information will be, there are a lot of trainers in Canada also. There's a question here about the person says, what about EFT with telehealth? It's interesting. I was thinking about that this morning because one of my early couples that I feel like I really cut my teeth on was done through telehealth, through Skype. And when I was trained, you know, Michael said he wasn't sure that it was very effective. It was a hard way to do EFT. But I will say I worked with this couple for a little over 2 years and very successfully, and they have a very successful relationship. And it's been about 5 years now since they finished their work. So yeah, I've had good experience with it. And I think other people are too, having good experience and getting used to it these days.
Excellent. So how often do you request to see couples? Is it weekly or until stage 2?
Well, I mean, I think that depends on your practice. I tend to have a small private practice, so I only see people every other week. And it seems to work fine. But some couples will say, you know, we need you more often. And even if I'm doing every other week, what I'll do is longer sessions, 1.5 hour sessions, 2 hour. I have actually discovered with a lot of couples that at about 50 minutes in, we get into the depth of the emotional cycle. And so 1.5 hour session is a great idea with EFT. Once you get going, first few sessions, you're just understanding and assessing. But when you get deeper into the work, you'll be able to assess that out with your particular client. But I have had clients who at 50 minutes are really dropping into the emotional piece, and you don't want to end the session, of course. So, yeah.
So there's a couple of questions about personality disorders and using EFT with that. Could you further explain that a little bit?
So, yeah, I think that's a complicated question, and I don't know if I can really answer it effectively, but I can say that there are certain sort of presentation, you know, a personality disorder for a lot of folks is like kind of rooted in attachment and attachment strategies. And so, you know, there's such complex defense mechanisms going on in personality disorders to cope with the emotionality and the attachment wounding that opening them up emotionally in that setting can feel very raw and very difficult for some folks with personality disorder. So I'm just going to say, you know, tread lightly and be vigilant and pay attention. If you start to see a situation where one of the partners really looks like they're having a hard time recovering from the emotional experience of a session, you know, you might be looking at someone with much more complicated trauma and what looks more like a personality disorder. And personally, I would make sure that they have their own therapist, and I would either go really, really slow with them or even refer them both out for individual therapy and have them come back later for couples work. So, yeah. On the other hand, there are a lot of folks who have personality disorders or personality disorder traits who are very high functioning and can manage that level of emotionality. So yeah, just be vigilant about that.
Excellent point. Wanted to remind everyone, we are sending out an email later this afternoon that will include a link to the recording as well as a link to Lynn's slides, so you can review this information again and use it, as you see fit in the future.
And also my email address, is that right, Chris?
Exactly. Your email
please
address
feel
will
free-
be.
Yeah, reach out to me, especially if you have questions about training. I can point you in different directions maybe. And yeah, happy to be in touch with folks who want to know more or just want to talk about it.
This was really excellent. And I want to thank you, Lynn, and thank our partners at the Red Oak family of facilities. This was a co-sponsored production with Bradford Health Services and Red Oak. So we are the leading provider of inpatient and outpatient substance abuse treatment programs in the Southeast. We have 3 facilities in North Carolina under the Red Oak umbrella. We have the Willows for women and Red Oak for men, as well as the Foothills for adolescent young men. And then we have our 2 facilities in Alabama, Madison and Warrior, as well as 2 long-term residential recovery centers for women and men in Tuscaloosa and Opelika. I'd encourage you to visit our websites for more information. We are accepting new admissions, and all of our facilities have precautions in place, including testing for COVID. So if anyone has those concerns, we are certainly addressing them and proceeding with abundance of caution for our new admissions. Thank you very much for joining us. Please be on the lookout for an email later today. I hope to see you all again soon and maybe do another program in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.